the first report from our research group, but we will present 3 once more during the day. Okay, let's start. So the main problem is how social movements emerge in a society which has been characterized by depoliticization. So depoliticization is not just political passivity or indifference towards politics and something else or something more. So we can say about depoliticized context and depoliticized personality. Of course, I simplify because we don't have much time. So depoliticized context is the lack of social movements, the lack of institutions, and also is stigmatization of protest behavior. But protest behavior is being stigmatized in post-communist world, not because movements are associated with crimes like neo-Nazis in Europe, but because in highly individualized society, the fact of collective action is transcending private interests and values, and that is why it is being considered as a threat to people's private interests and values from other private interests. So it's a special type of stigmatization in individualized society. Mark Howard, who studied Russian protest movements and NGOs, argued that not only the lack of resources, not only the lack of institutions is the cause of political passivity, but people, their way of life, their values. So he argued that even when the very different agents from the government to Western foundations gave people many resources and many incentives to create movements and NGOs, they refused to participate. His main argument was that so they have friendship as depoliticized collective environment, so they don't need participation in any protest movement, but also because they distrust politics in general. Depoliticized personality is lack of collective identities and the fear of collective action, which is considered like something which threats my personal interests. So our research question is how depoliticized personality influences dynamics of newly created local movements. We studied a few local movements who were created by these civil observers Ivan just talked about. Sveta will say about the genesis of these new local movements, and these movements are very new. And so, what is precise our question is how some features of this depoliticized personality, which previously hindered political engagement, when previously distracted people from political participation, now become the part of ethic of political action. So we will show how this fear of collective action, the refusion to become a part of collective, now serve as not factor which distrust people from politics, but becomes part of how they do political activism. And why this question? Not only because we are especially interested in subjective aspect, subjective dimension of social movement dynamics, but also because, as Donatello said, sometimes agency is crucial, and here we have unique experimental cases. Movements are very new, so they consist of newcomers. They don't have resources, and government didn't repress them, have not repressed them yet. That is why the fate of this movement depends on creativity of these people, depends on how these people do behave politically, how do they construct by themselves the groups. So it doesn't work. Okay, Sveta, please.
And now I will say a few words about our field. So, as Oleg already said, the groups which we studied have been created by election observers. So, after the elections, some participants of observers movement decided to continue the protest activity and joined or created some local activist movements. The activities of these movements focused, for example, on municipal elections, on some local environmental problem, or monitoring of local authorities' works. And we suppose that the wave of creation of such movements is very important and unnoticed tendency. For example, we can find out at least 17 such kind of groups in Moscow, 9 in Moscow region, 4 in St. Petersburg, and 6 in St. Petersburg region. And about our data, so this presentation based on semi-structured in-depth interviews with the activists of 3 groups. The first is Civil Alliance of Citizens from St. Petersburg, the second is headquarters from Moscow, and the third is the group of observers from Moscow also. And the name of the groups, of course, are changed here and that of anonymity and safety of the activists. We use here 17 interviews with the activists collected from May 2012 to January 2013. So it was during the first year of group's activity, and 14 interviews with the same activist collected in September 2013. It was the second year of activity of these groups. And on the next slide you can see our main methods. And also a few words about the specificity of activity of such groups. So these newly created movements are at the first sight similar to some Russian local movements which have been starting before the rallies. For example, the activists of these newly created local movements often do the same things that local movements did before the rallies. For example, I don't know, struggle against clear cutting of public parks, etc. But there is a very important difference between them. So previous movements were mobilized by immediate problems that locals faced in their areas, and such problems are like a matter of life and death for the people. And the newly created movements have the reverse logic. So it's logic from general, universal to instrumental. So they mobilized and united not because of immediate problems, but in order to reproduce or sustain collective action they experienced in the rallies. So they choose the problems to solve and target to struggle only after the groups were created and were established. And in this case, the choice of a gender are arbitrary. For example, you can see on the slide a quotation from our interview. Concerning your question, how we choose what to do whatsoever, because there are a lot of things to do. And Oleg,
yes. We use quotations here illustratively, but we chose the typical ones, so which we can meet in the narratives in all the groups. So what is general for all the group? In fact, 4, not 3, but here we based on analysis of 3 groups. So the common thing from all of them is the original motive to create groups was the experience of collective action in the rallies and then in the civil observers movement. So, like Donatella said also, we can say here about the impact of event. So they experienced event of collective action which was transformative for them, and they wanted to sustain this collective action in new circumstances after rallies declined, and the issue of agenda was secondary for them. You can see here a very typical quotation. So we ask, how did you decide to struggle over these local problems? And the answer is, after the rallies and the monitoring, we realized that it is not over, that something bonds us, so we need to continue. Now our main hypothesis. Now these local movements, which participants were so aspired in the beginning, in crisis, we would like to know why. So there are various factors, of course, resources, repressions, hostile environment, etc. But we would like to investigate one factor. So how this depoliticized personality I talked about previously influence the group activity, the dynamics of group activity. And our hypothesis is the initial aspiration to sustain collective activity, to sustain collective action by creating these local movements is undermined by people's depoliticized personality, by the inertia of their habitus, very individualistic and very depoliticized.
Okay, so what was surprising for us when we were talking with those people, that something like after 6 months after creation of those groups, they face with a crisis. What does it mean? That means that people who participate in those initiatives, they said that they spent less and less time for the activism, and their groups became really disordered. So what is important when we are talking about the reason of those crises? The first thing is that we want to mention is how those groups and the work within those groups was organized and is still organized. This is a project work that means that people do different projects. The topic of those projects can be really different. That can be some local elections, that can be some environmental solving of environmental problems or something else. The second thing, what is very important for people who participate in those movements is the values of freedom, of self-reliance, and they are ready to respect those values. Then they're talking about people who also participate in those groups. The second thing that is very important is what we call the ethic of depoliticized political action. What does it mean? First, it means that people who participate in those local movements, they perceive their participation as a voluntary individual contribution. Voluntary means first that they participate because this is something what is interested them personally. That means that I'm interested in ecological problems. I'm solving ecological problems. I'm interested in politics and elections, so I'm interested in those projects. Second thing, what does mean voluntary is the will. That means that they participate when they want, and then they don't want, they participate. They don't participate in some projects. So we have a nice citation when a person said that the group is a free association, and if one wants to do something, one does. If one doesn't want to do it, one doesn't do it. When they engaged in a good machine of propaganda, that was a Navalny project, I don't participate. I don't want, and I don't do. And only if I want, I do.
And many of them insisted that it's our main principle, not impose to others what they should do, to defend their own right to do what they want.
Yes, so this is something like a common and a legitimate value for every participant of the group. The second thing about the ethic of depoliticized political action is that those activists demonstratively claim their rights to refuse to participate. What means that if they don't want to participate, as I said, they won't participate. If they don't want to do something, I don't want to protect a park, they won't do it. If they don't want to participate in local electoral campaigns, they won't participate, still being the part of the group. This claim to not to participate if they don't want can become the reason to leave the group. So in this situation, you can see that the person said that she wasn't to be that this is hard for her to follow the collective opinion, and maybe not the collective, but she just don't want to obey an opinion of a majority. That it was a situation of a conflict within group, and they can't manage what they want to do. So
let's stop maybe here. I mean, not stop, but it's very good quotation because this girl, she was one of the leaders, so she became responsible for the main project of a group, so defense of public park from clear cutting. And so what she told that I was near, I could stop doing this, could escape my project of struggling against the clear cutting, not because I've decided to escape, but because it's hard for me to follow and to obey an opinion of a majority.
No, Natasha has already said that as a result of such contradictions and such conflicts, the movement's activities turns into a set of individual projects. This happens because of not because of lack of coordination, etc., but because of some values that are fundamental for the participants. just want to read one quotation. So, for example, one people say that I'm acting as coordinator. In this case, I coordinate this particular work. Someone is engaged in something else. I take responsibility for this work, and I myself look for the external resources and negotiate with local authority. So
with emphasis on myself.
Yes. This man is responsible himself for all kind of work he do, yeah.
So everything was okay at the beginning, but in a 6 month, all those principles and values, they resulted in a total frustration, and that the activity of the group became just a set of really separated activities of different persons who sometimes didn't know about what other member of the group is doing at the same moment. So that led to the deep frustration of some participants, because they can't organize, they can't really achieve their goals when they're trying to realize their project. So I will give you only one quotation. And what is the most important thing? That at the beginning we have a group of individuals, and in the moment of crisis we have just individuals which are insisted on which are totally disappointed of this experience of collective action, and which are talking about themselves as separate individuals who can act by themselves without any society or without any collective. So the person, also the leader of another group, said that actually not everything depends on a local group. Everything depends only on personality. If someone wants to do something, one will, and one doesn't need a group. And one doesn't need a lot of money too. As for me, I don't need a group at all. I can do everything by myself. So in the conclusion, we can say that the mass protests, they produce some new forms of social movements and protest activities because people want to sustain this experience of the collective action, of collective and of action. But at the same time, the protest movement permanently failed because of the inertia of the politicized individualistic personality, because of those ethics of the politicization.
Yes.
Personality.
Depoliticized political participation,
Yes.
which is considered like one-time personal act. So if I have one minute more, I just wanted to say that now we presented just one tendency, which is common for all the groups. But of course, there are many differences which contribute to the level of successfulness of these groups. I just want to name the three, the most important three. So resources. The fourth group have much more resources. For example, they have their own news, mass media. So local newspaper. They are a local newspaper, and that is why they can get the access to locals and to distribute their agenda. Then eventfulness. If sometimes some events from the outside happen and mobilize people from outside, so they are more active in the same more successful group. So rallies for fair elections, then clear cutting of the forest, then electoral campaign of Navalny, etc. Were one by one. That is why this eventfulness of the environment contributed to the more activity. And the last point is in this successful group we can see like harmony between collective identity, organizational principles, and agenda. So the group consists of people who are very patriotic, who really have strong collective identity of this local town. We don't have it in another cases. So their organizational principles are local too. So the group for people from our town. And agenda is also focused on town's problems. So this harmony between these things we think also very important for the success. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Donatella.
I've discussed this, of course, a lot with Oleg. I found the research very interesting. I don't like the concept of implications, and maybe I understand it better linked to the research, but I want to explain you which one would be my objections and suggestions for alternative terms. One of the reasons why I think I'm against this type of concepts is I'm Sicilian and I've seen a lot of Americans coming to my country and saying, you are a moral feminist, you are depoliticized, you do not. And then you see that in some cases, Italy, Spain, Greece, the uncivic countries are those in which you find most protests. So I think one has to be careful in accepting these concepts which are sort of stigmatization from outside. But also I think as a concept, depolitizations tends to imply that there was a political aptitude and now it is no longer there. While I think that what you have described fits very well in the definitions of personalized politics, so Lichtenmann and others who have suggested that there are two different forms of collective actions and of conceptions of politics. One is more communitarian, and the other one is more personalized. Also, Occupy is typical of the personalized type, and so on. And so, also in a context in which personalized politics, so I don't want to do it, I don't do it, is something we find, for instance, in the global justice movement, which means I don't trust my organization so much that I obey the organizations. I have my own consciousness and I act upon this. I think, according to me, would fit better what you found and would also indicate that, as in other cases, there are a type of organizational strategies which resonate with this type of personalized politics, which is not necessarily against collective actions, but against some types of collective actions. Once I was on a podium discussions with the leader of a trade union of the past, and he said, for us, organizational strength in politics meant we could call for a strike for 5 minutes, and after 5 minutes people would go back to work. I said, my activists, the activists I studied, would never obey the organizations. They would rather do the same. My organization doesn't join this rally. I go with a t-shirt saying, I belong to these organizations, but I am here. So very similar to what you say. And I think that these ideas of personalized politics linked to some trends of individualizations, but especially subjectivity, could be more useful than the concept of depolitization.
May I follow up with that? I had more or less the same question, but framed in a different way. If you want to introduce the concept of depersonalized personality as an explanation of the process, then you're basically replacing the problem, because now you have to explain where this depersonalized personality comes from. It's not a immaculate conception. So you still have to explain how it comes.
Thank you very much, and we will discuss it later. But I want, and I totally agree with the danger of stigmatization, and about organizational types is also very important. Now we are going to study that. So, but about what you and Bert said, just a small remark. So, why depoliticization and where depoliticized personality come from? Our parents were politicized. I mean, not personally mine, but our generation during perestroika, during the end of 1980s, and then they experienced disappointment, and that is why they rejected politics. So they became depoliticized after their politicization. And then, during socialization, they imposed their children that politics is something you don't need personally. But in individualized society, what you don't need personally is something very dangerous, something that threats you. So this rejection of politicization is passed from generation to generation during socialization. So we have the same rejection, but in a new form. So it's just my answer to this question.
Many questions, guys. Well, we will have to run late on the next talks too. Jack.
I think you're right about the parents' generation. I don't know if the depoliticization is transmitted across generations as you suggest. The fact that these people are engaged in protest suggests that they are interpreting their political action in some positive way. But you are correct that they are failing to sustain an organizational commitment and discipline. This, however, is not unique. And that what stunned me about the Occupy Wall Street movement is that the protesters in Occupy Wall Street and the other Occupy movements across America and Europe displayed exactly the same characteristics. That when people came to them and said, "This is a great movement, labor would like to join you," they said, "No, we don't want to be associated with any organization." And when they were told, "This is a great movement, you have support, you can build on it, you need to organize to present to the media, you need to organize your space," they said, "No, we think organization is dangerous, organization is damaging, we want to be individual free spirits, and our protest is our rejection of all organization." The result of that is that what was a very promising start failed to have any broader impact, and eventually the very internal lack of organization led to their being classified as a nuisance and a problem, because they weren't presenting a very positive face. So this phenomenon that you've identified, I think, is real. I think it's become pervasive, and I don't know why it is so pervasive, but I think it's more than just disillusionment after the perestroika affecting the next generation. It seems to be something about the way this generation interprets political action that's very different than Donatello's union workers, who knew you had to follow the plan, you had to act together. That no longer seems to be their view.
Thanks.
Mary McCoy.
Yes, I take my question to you. I'm not clear on the relationship, as you see it, between these new groups and those who existed from at least 2008. We've seen all this local activity happening, which has been written about. And when you give your quotations, you know, the personal quotations, etc., etc., you'll find, you can find all those quotations coming in different works from 2000, well, it really begins to really get stronger 2009, 2010. I don't know if you know the work by Grani from Perm. Yes, their work, Makovetskaya, where in fact they look at both NGOs and they look at the non-organized ones, and they're coming up with what you come up with, that we have this new sort of unorganized, unregistered activity, which is very personal in a way. Now what I'm not clear is what you're suggesting is new about these post-2012 organizations. Are they any different from those informal, not registered organizations that were before? I mean, before we also had, not really local, didn't we? We didn't just have the blue buckets, but we had the fires and we had the floods, which actually got in national movements involved. Now, are you saying that since 2012, we're really seeing yet a third type of protest organization or grouping appearing? And if you are, then I'm not clear from what you say how it really differs from the ones that we had before. If I could just say one other thing, the interesting point that the Grani group make is that one of the consequences of the clampdown on organized protests and on the organized NGOs is to make the new groupings even more anxious not to register and to retain, as you could say, their kind of spontaneous character. And I think that for the analysis, you've got to bring in the reaction from the authorities as well in order to explain what kinds of movements or protests we're seeing.
Thank you very much. Short answer, and then maybe Natasha also will answer. The main difference is that even though they could do the same or face the same problems, the initial motives of those groups was not to solve concrete problems, but to sustain collectivity. That is why their individualistic habitus contradicts their own initial goal, their own initial motive, to feel, to reproduce the feeling, the experience of collective action after they have been depoliticized, and never face these feelings, these emotions, and such experience. So that's the main difference from this new local, of this new local movements.
Yes, and I also want to add something. This is, yes, one difference, what Oleg mentioned. And the second thing, which is important, this is, you are right, because the movements like this, which we described, they existed before. For example, that was some what called city movements, which trying to make the city more comfortable, more beautiful, and more suitable for living for ordinary persons. So this is also those movements in Krymsk of volunteers in Krymsk and others. But what is interesting that if we compare those groups, and actually you can see this, the first picture, this is the picture from Navalny campaign, the new Navalny campaign, which calls People Deputy. And you see a person who consists of millions of different separated persons. What is interesting that the groups which were organized like our local groups, they existed before. But now, after the rallies, this logic of organization, of collective action, they exist before, and there were other groups described by Kliman. But after rallies, we have as I see it, two main tendencies. This is those local groups first, and Navalny campaigns, Mayor Navalny campaigns, then what is going now, his campaign before the election to Moscow Duma. Those two movements, they are organized according to those principles, not to principles like when people mobilized by special problems, by the principles of which exist before, but they were just one of that was just one type of the movement. But now, after rallies, this is for me. It seems that it became much more dominant. Those principles and organization which are based on those principles.
Just to return to this debate, the depoliticized personality and its usefulness, I think the only way to make this concept useful is to show its contingency and to historicize it, as you began to do, but I would actually like to push you a little further in that historicization, because I think that, I can count at least three sources of depoliticization. And one is these often phantom pains from Soviet memory, and I experienced that very clearly as a graduate student organizing my American institution when I was an organizer for the Slavic department, mostly made up of Russians or emigres, and I could tell that whenever I was speaking to my colleagues, with friends otherwise, about various solidarity actions, petitions, coming to rallies, they were hearing a consumer organizer, a consumer activist, because to them that language of solidarность рабочими was a reference to Soviet Iran. I had to occasionally switch to English, which is a somewhat more neutral language. So this is the first source, phantom pains. Secondly, obviously political violence, like 90th October 93, or violence, against labor union activists, etc. A major source of depoliticization, and a third source, which I've seen often and experienced myself, is very often intentional but terribly organized activist events, out of which many people come thinking I'm not showing up. There are others, but I think it would really be good to make this concept of depoliticized personality very historical and contingent and not.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay,
We have it. Yes.
You have it.
I suggest also an historical comparison. There is this brilliant book by Yena Zubkov about the popular opinion or общественное настроение in the latest days of Stalin. And it's quite interesting if we compare that book with yours, because she finds, after the Second World War, a rediscovery of richness, of individuality, which is not the opposite of politicization. First thing is that, sure you know very well, is that this prepares some kind of civic activism of the obscure of the thought. So it would be interesting.
Okay, Karin.
Yes. Thank you very much. I also very skeptical about the term
Depoliticization.
depoliticization. I don't think it's a good factor to explain the unsuccessfulness of these groups. I want to tell you, Oleg, but I think maybe during the perestroika, most of the people who went to the street at that time were socialized also in an idea that politics is not a right thing to do. So it's not good.
This is not true. Not in Soviet Union.
I think it's very, yes, I agree with Natalya, it's very more or part-time activism or individual activism, I don't know. But what do you think? In the groups I observed, so the groups that began to mobilize on the basis of local problem-specific issues, I think there is more politics and more sense of collectiveness than in your cases. Do you think it's possible to go from general issues to local issues and nevertheless to have a more or less sustainable, strong collective group? Under which conditions is it possible to grow from general issues to more concrete one? I think maybe the Navalny campaign is an example of a successful, of such a successful experience. Why? Is it because of the figure of a leader? Is it because of the charismatic figure of a leader?
Natasha has, because it's her idea.
About Navalny company, it is the principles are the same as those we can find in our groups, but this is a campaign which organized in another way, because it's a big campaign, a huge campaign with a center, with a leader first, and with a bureaucratic organization in the core, because actually they have an organization which just plan and distribute some activities, and a lot of volunteers who do different things. And so this is just this is the type of successful campaign. But this group, if we're talking about this campaign, is a movement. This movement is organized a little bit differently, because in our case we don't have this bureaucratic organization in the center.
So in
of
our
the
case,
movement.
pure self-organization, and concerning so not organization plus self-organization like in Navalny's campaign, but only self-organization. And about your first question, it's a very good question. We don't know, it's an open question. Maybe it's necessary to go firstly through these steps of organic creation of collectivity. And Natasha supposes that it's impossible to sustain collectivity without these first steps. But it's an open question. We don't know, and it would be interesting to discuss it.
I want to add methodologically to the comments of Natalya and Jack, with which I agree, that also in the situation of an interview, obviously people are very emphatically telling you that actually they are against collectivity or individualists, but we know these people actually participated in collective action. So they are kind of trying to justify in front of you, or to resist your pressure, because they might see you as agents of normative ideals of collectivism, which you are. They might feel it. So one has to be careful about this. The picture is obviously the resultant of two forces. One, social dissolution and individualization, and another very strong push for collectivity that is there in the society, and not only on the liberal side. We've discussed Putin's concerns to put people together, which are basically going in the same direction.
Small thing I could add, because I agree with this, and I think also one of the consequences is it is extremely risky to talk about personality on the basis of this type of interviews, because personality is something much more stable than expressed values, and I would not feel so easy as a sociologist to say that I can find out the personality of the person. I will leave this to psychologists, even more psychanalysts, and so on. And the idea is personality is something which you don't change every 2 years, when in this case you have waves of participation every 2 years. So personalities and other can change. There is